The transmission failed at the worst possible moment, which is to say, exactly when German tank doctrine predicted it would. Private First Class Danny Sullivan felt the Sherman shudder beneath him at 0847 hours on June 4, 1944, heard that grinding metal-on-metal scream that every tank crew in Normandy had nightmares about, and watched his driver's face go white in the dim red light of the crew compartment. They were 200 yards from the assembly point at Weymouth Harbor, surrounded by 412 other tanks preparing for D-Day. And Sullivan's Sherman, tank number 2 to 34, Lucky Lou, just became a 20-ton paperweight. Worse, it became a death sentence for 5 men who would hit Omaha Beach in 2 days with a transmission that could seize up under fire at any moment. Sullivan's hands were black with hydraulic fluid, and his back ached from 14 straight hours working on these machines. But he dropped through the bottom escape hatch anyway, squirming under the tank's belly to reach the transmission housing, while around him the entire invasion force prepared to cross the English Channel. He had maybe 15 minutes before some officer noticed Lucky Lou wasn't moving and started asking questions that would end with Sullivan in the brig. The problem was simple, brutal, and unsolvable, or so every tank expert from Detroit to Washington had concluded after 2 years of catastrophic failures. The Sherman M4A1 used a controlled differential system with hydraulic pressure valves that regulated power distribution to the tracks. Beautiful engineering in theory. Except the pressure relief valve, a precisely machined component costing $47 and requiring 3 weeks to manufacture, cracked under sustained combat stress approximately 30% of the time. When it cracked, hydraulic pressure spiked, seals blew, transmission fluid sprayed across red-hot engine components, and the entire drivetrain seized within 90 seconds. At the tank testing grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland, engineers could maintain these valves perfectly and achieve failure rates below 5%. In combat, with mud and dust and constant vibration and crews too exhausted to perform proper maintenance, the failure rate hit 32% in North Africa and 41% in Italy. That meant 2 out of every 5 Sherman tanks would break down in the middle of battle, stranding crews under German fire, while Panzers methodically destroyed them. The mathematics were murderous. A disabled Sherman survived an average of 4 minutes before being hit, and crew survival rates from a burning tank were estimated at 12%. Sullivan lay on his back in the mud under Lucky Lou's transmission housing, staring at the cracked pressure valve by the light of his battered Army flashlight. He could see the fracture clearly, a hairline split running along the valve body, where repeated pressure spikes had finally exceeded the steel's fatigue limit. Standard procedure required removing the entire transmission, shipping it back to depot maintenance, waiting 6 weeks for a replacement valve from the States, and reassembling everything. Lucky Lou would miss the invasion. The crew would be reassigned to another tank, probably one with an equally stressed transmission. Or Sullivan could do what every tank mechanic in the European theater was doing: ignore the crack, refill the hydraulic fluid, hope the valve held for another few days, and let the statistical gods decide who lived and died. He'd done exactly that 17 times in the past month, sent 17 tanks toward combat, knowing their transmissions were cracked, heard about 4 of them burning in Italy, with their crews screaming inside. Sullivan was 23 years old, a former Ford assembly line worker from Dearborn who joined the Army in 1942 because he was good with machines and figured he could help win the war by keeping tanks running. Instead, he was sending men to die in machines he knew were broken. The spoon was in his pocket because mess hall had been 3 hours ago, and Sullivan forgot to return it. He pulled it out now, a standard GI mess spoon, stainless steel, bent at a 30-degree angle because Sullivan had a habit of absent-mindedly bending things while thinking. He looked at the spoon, looked at the cracked valve, looked back at the spoon. The bend put him in mind of something his uncle showed him back in Detroit when Sullivan was 14, a trick for maintaining pressure in a busted radiator hose using a bent piece of coat hanger that created a bypass channel. Not proper engineering. Just something that worked when proper engineering wasn't available. Sullivan measured the bend against the valve housing, estimated angles and tolerances purely by eye, and then did something that would either save 5 lives or get him court-martialed. He wedged the bent spoon into the valve assembly, positioned precisely so the spoon's curve created a secondary pressure relief path. When hydraulic pressure spiked, it would now bleed through the gap between the spoon and the valve body instead of cracking the valve further. Crude as hell, not remotely up to Army engineering standards. But it would work. It took him 7 minutes to wire the spoon in place using mechanics wire from his toolkit, creating a semi-permanent installation that would survive the vibration and heat of combat operations. He slithered out from under Lucky Lou at 0902 hours, covered in hydraulic fluid and mud, and yelled up to his driver, "Fire her up!" The transmission engaged with a sound that was slightly different from standard, a faint metallic ringing from the spoon resonating against the housing. But the tank rolled forward smoothly. Sullivan stood there breathing hard, watching Lucky Lou complete a full circuit of the staging area, tracks churning, engine roaring, transmission holding pressure. The spoon trick worked. More than that, it worked better than he expected because the secondary pressure path actually reduced stress on the main valve, lowering the chance of further cracking. Sullivan did some quick mental math standing there in the mud. If the spoon reduced transmission failure rates from 30% to even 20%, that was 200 tanks, 1,000 crew members who might survive battles they'd otherwise die in. The ethical calculation that followed took Sullivan approximately 8 seconds. Unauthorized modification of combat equipment carried a maximum sentence of 5 years in military prison. But standing by while men burned in tanks with broken transmissions because proper Army procedure required 6-week depot repairs? That wasn't ethics. That was just bureaucratic murder. Sullivan pulled out his notebook, tore out a page, and spent the next 40 minutes walking through the staging areas at Weymouth Harbor, looking at transmission housings, identifying 340 tanks with cracked or stressed pressure valves based on visible fluid leaks and mechanical sound analysis. He marked each tank with a small chalk X on the left track guard. Then, at 16:30 hours, when the day maintenance shift ended, Sullivan told his sergeant he was staying late to finish paperwork. What he actually did was commit 340 separate acts of equipment sabotage, or salvation, depending on who was judging. The modification had to be done in darkness because even sympathetic officers couldn't ignore a mechanic crawling under 300 tanks in broad daylight. Sullivan worked through the night of June 4th, moving from tank to tank with his bag of bent spoons. He'd raided the mess hall after dinner, bent 40 spoons into the correct angle, and stuffed them in his jacket. Each installation took approximately 6 minutes. Drop through bottom hatch, locate pressure valve, wire spoon in place, test for clearance, mark completion. By 0400 on June 5th, he'd modified 127 tanks, and his hands were raw, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, shaking from exhaustion. By 0300 on June 6th, D-Day morning, 3 hours before the first wave hit Omaha Beach, Sullivan finished tank number 340, crawled out from under the last Sherman, and stood in the pre-dawn darkness looking at an armored regiment that now carried his unauthorized modifications into the largest amphibious invasion in human history. If the spoons worked, thousands of men might survive. If they failed, if they jammed transmissions or caused catastrophic mechanical failure at the worst possible moment, Danny Sullivan would be responsible for one of the greatest disasters in American military history. He made it back to his tent at 0340 hours, lay down on his cot still covered in hydraulic fluid and mud, and had exactly 47 minutes before reveille. He didn't sleep. He stared at the canvas ceiling, thought about his uncle's radiator trick, thought about proper engineering versus field expedient repairs, thought about the 1,100 men crewing those 340 tanks he'd just modified without authorization. The mathematical probability that at least one officer would notice the modifications was approximately 100%. The probability that Sullivan would face court-martial was only slightly lower. But the probability that the modifications would save lives? Sullivan put that at around 90%, based on his understanding of hydraulic pressure and steel fatigue and the simple physics of providing an alternate flow path. In his mind, the calculation was straightforward. 5 years in Leavenworth was a reasonable price for saving 1,000 lives. The invasion launched at 0630 hours on June 6, 1944. Sullivan stood on the beach at Weymouth, watching the Armada depart, 156,000 men, 5,000 ships, and somewhere in that massive force were 340 Sherman tanks, carrying bent mess hall spoons wired into their transmissions. He wouldn't know if his modifications worked until after-action reports came back, wouldn't know if he'd saved lives or caused disasters, wouldn't know if he was a hero or a war criminal until someone with authority examined those tanks and started asking questions. The waiting was worse than the work. Sullivan spent D-Day and D+1 performing routine maintenance on reserve tanks, replacing track links and adjusting gun sights, doing normal mechanic work while obsessively listening for any report of catastrophic transmission failures in the invasion force. The reports that came back from Normandy on June 7th and 8th were confused, chaotic, full of casualty figures and tactical assessments. But one statistic caught Sullivan's attention. Sherman mechanical failure rates were running at approximately 18%, well below the expected 32%. Tanks were surviving longer under fire. Crews were completing combat missions instead of burning in disabled vehicles. On June 9, 1944, at 1420 hours, Sullivan was arrested. Captain Raymond Wheeler, battalion maintenance officer and a former automotive engineer from General Motors, personally escorted Sullivan to the command tent and read him the charges. Unauthorized modification of equipment, 340 counts, misappropriation of government property, the spoons, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Wheeler had examined 12 tanks that returned from Normandy for battle damage repair, found the spoon modifications on all 12, and traced the chalk marks back to Sullivan through witness testimony from other mechanics who'd seen him working at night. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for June 11th. Maximum sentence if convicted. 5 years hard labor. Captain Wheeler made the situation clear in simple terms. Private Sullivan, you modified 340 tanks without authorization. Each modification potentially compromised combat effectiveness and safety. The Army cannot tolerate this kind of freelance engineering regardless of your intentions. Sullivan said nothing. What could he say? He did exactly what he was accused of doing. The evidence was incontrovertible. But then the statistics started coming in from Normandy, and the mathematics became impossible to ignore. Between June 6th and June 9th, the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions reported 340 tanks operational in frontline combat, the exact number Sullivan had modified. Of those 340, mechanical failures requiring evacuation occurred in 61 tanks, an 18% failure rate. The remaining 279 tanks stayed in combat through sustained engagement with German Panzer forces, and preliminary assessments credited them with 43 confirmed Panzer kills and successful support for infantry advances that captured 12 kilometers of territory. In the same period, unmodified Sherman tanks operating with the 4th Armored Division showed 34% mechanical failures and achieved 8 confirmed Panzer kills. The difference was dramatic enough that division maintenance officers started asking questions about why one armored regiment's tanks were so much more reliable than another's. When they examined the reliable tanks, they found the spoons. The preliminary hearing on June 11th lasted 14 minutes before being interrupted by German artillery hitting the Weymouth staging area. 6 shells, probable 150 mm, that killed 3 men and wounded 17 others, but more importantly, disrupted all administrative proceedings for 48 hours. By June 13th, when military justice resumed, Captain Wheeler had received orders from division headquarters. Deliver Private Sullivan to Forward Maintenance Depot in Normandy, immediately. The court-martial was postponed indefinitely. Sullivan crossed the Channel on June 14th aboard a LST loaded with replacement tanks, still technically under arrest, still facing 5 years in prison, but also carrying orders to report to Lieutenant Colonel Howard Brooks, 3rd Armored Division Maintenance Commander. Brooks met Sullivan on Omaha Beach at 16:30 hours on June 14th, 300 yards from where men still occasionally found body parts in the sand, and said exactly 4 words before handing Sullivan a map. "Show me the modification." They drove inland in a jeep, past burning hedgerows and disabled German equipment, to a forward maintenance area where 8 Sherman tanks sat awaiting repair. Brooks pointed at the first tank. Sullivan spent 20 minutes showing him the spoon installation, explaining the hydraulic pressure theory, demonstrating how the secondary relief path reduced valve stress. Brooks listened without expression, occasionally asking technical questions that revealed his own engineering background. When Sullivan finished, Brooks walked along the line of 8 tanks, examined each modification, measured clearances with calipers from his field kit, and finally turned back to Sullivan with an assessment that would determine whether the young mechanic went to prison or stayed in the war. "This is the worst piece of engineering I've ever seen. It violates 6 different Army technical manuals. The installation is crude, the materials are inappropriate, and the whole approach is completely unauthorized." Brooks paused, looked directly at Sullivan. "It's also the most effective field modification of the entire European campaign. Show me how to train other mechanics to install it." The court-martial disappeared, not officially dismissed, just quietly forgotten in the chaos of the Normandy campaign. Sullivan spent June 15th through June 19th training 17 mechanics from 3 armored divisions on the spoon modification technique. He demonstrated the installation procedure, explained the pressure theory, emphasized the importance of correct spoon angle and wire tension. The Army's official response to unauthorized engineering was to standardize it, distribute it, and turn one mechanic's improvisation into doctrinal procedure without ever actually acknowledging what they were doing. By June 20, 1944, approximately 840 Sherman tanks in Normandy carried the spoon modification. By June 25th, that number exceeded 1,200. And then the modifications started showing up in combat assessments, and the numbers became impossible for anyone, especially the Germans, to ignore. But that was still ahead of Sullivan on the evening of June 14th, when he finished his demonstration for Lieutenant Colonel Brooks and stood in a muddy field in Normandy, wondering if he'd just escaped prison or simply postponed it. Brooks handed him a set of corporal's stripes and said something that Sullivan would remember for the rest of his life. "The difference between a court-martial and a commendation is often just timing and results. You got lucky on both. Don't waste it." Then German Panzers hit the maintenance depot at 2145 hours, and Danny Sullivan discovered that staying alive in Normandy required more than just fixing transmissions. The Panzer IV appeared through the smoke at 2147 hours, track guards scraping the narrow hedgerow lane, its long-barreled 75mm gun traversing toward the maintenance depot, where Sullivan and Brooks stood, next to 8 partially disassembled Sherman tanks that couldn't move, couldn't fight, and were about to become coffins for every man in the compound. Sullivan's first thought was absurdly technical. He noticed the Panzer's transmission was running smooth, no grinding, Germans didn't have Sherman problems, and his second thought was pure animal terror as the gun barrels swung toward them. Brooks screamed, "Get down!" and shoved Sullivan behind a disabled Sherman just as the Panzer fired. The 75mm shell hit the ground 15 yards away, threw dirt and shrapnel in a fountain of cordite stink and ringing metal, and Sullivan tasted copper fear in his mouth while his hands scrabbled for something, anything, that could help them survive the next 30 seconds. What he found was a wrench. What he needed was a miracle. But then Lieutenant Morrison, commanding officer of the maintenance depot's security detail, did something either brilliant or suicidal. He jumped into one of the repaired Shermans, the one Sullivan had just demonstrated the spoon modification on, and fired up the engine. The Panzer was reloading, taking its time because disabled maintenance depots don't shoot back, and Morrison had maybe 20 seconds before the next shell turned his Sherman into burning scrap. Sullivan watched Morrison's tank lurch forward with that slight metallic ring from the spoon resonating in the transmission housing, watched the turret traverse with painful slowness because the hydraulic systems were still being bled after reassembly. Watched the 75mm gun elevate and lock onto the Panzer at point-blank range, 80 yards, close enough to see the German commander's face in the cupola hatch. Morrison fired. The armor-piercing round hit the Panzer's side armor at an angle that shouldn't have penetrated, but at 80 yards the kinetic energy was massive enough to punch through anyway, and the German tank shuddered, lurched sideways, stopped moving. Smoke poured from the engine deck. The crew bailed out through every hatch, 3 men running, 1 man on fire. Morrison's Sherman kept rolling, transmission holding pressure perfectly despite the rough combat start and 0 warm-up time. Sullivan heard Brooks beside him say quietly, "That tank wasn't supposed to be combat-ready for another 6 hours. Your spoon got it moving." The engagement lasted another 17 minutes, 2 more German tanks probing the maintenance depot, both driven off by Morrison's Sherman and supporting fire from infantry positions. And when the shooting stopped, Sullivan found himself standing in a compound lit by burning vehicles, while maintenance crews examined Morrison's tank with something approaching religious reverence. The transmission had run continuously for 23 minutes under combat stress, including rapid acceleration, hard braking, and sustained operations at high RPM. Normal Sherman transmissions would have shown stress signs after that kind of abuse. Morrison's showed none. The spoon was still securely wired in place, the hydraulic pressure was stable at optimal levels, and every maintenance officer in the depot wanted to know how the hell a bent mess hall spoon had just saved their lives. Over the next 11 days, June 15th through June 25th, 1944, Danny Sullivan's spoon modification transformed from desperate improvisation into the single most effective force multiplier in the Normandy campaign. The numbers told a story so dramatic that post-war analysts initially assumed the data was corrupted. Sherman tanks equipped with spoon modifications achieved average combat operational rates of 82% versus 59% for unmodified tanks. They stayed in battle longer, completed more missions, and most importantly, killed more German armor. The first major engagement showcasing the modification's impact occurred on June 17th during the Battle for St. Lo, when elements of the 3rd Armored Division encountered a German Panzer company, 14 Panzer IVs and 2 Panthers, in hedgerow country that was supposed to be impassable for armor. The American force consisted of 26 Sherman tanks, 19 equipped with Sullivan's modification. The battle lasted 4 hours and demonstrated exactly why transmission reliability mattered more than armor thickness or gun caliber. Captain James Hartwick, commanding the American Tank Company, watched 3 of his 7 unmodified Shermans break down within the first 40 minutes, transmissions seizing exactly as Army engineers predicted they would, leaving the tanks stranded in kill zones while German gunners methodically destroyed them. Hartwick's after-action report, filed on June 19th, describes the sequence with brutal clarity. Tank 2-7 suffered transmission failure at 14:34 hours while maneuvering for firing position. Crew attempted field repairs under fire. German Panzer IV engaged at 400 yards, 2-7 destroyed. All crew KIA. Tank 3-12 transmission seized at 15:11 hours during withdrawal from engagement. Crew abandoned vehicle. 3-12 destroyed by German infantry with Panzerfaust. Tank 418 lost hydraulic pressure at 15:47 hours. Crew remained with vehicle, attempted to fight as stationary pillbox. German flanking attack. 418 destroyed. 3 crew KIA, 2 wounded. But the 19 modified Shermans kept fighting. Hartwick watched tanks that should have broken down complete maneuvers that stressed transmissions beyond design limits, rapid reversals, sharp turns on muddy ground, sustained high-speed running through rough terrain. Tank 214, commanded by Sergeant Frank Kowalski, engaged 3 different German positions over a span of 97 minutes, covering approximately 4 kilometers of hedgerow, fighting that involved 14 separate movement-to-firing position sequences. Every one of those movements should have increased transmission stress. Instead, the spoon modification bled off pressure spikes, kept the hydraulic system stable, allowed Kowalski to maneuver aggressively, while unmodified tanks had to baby their transmissions to avoid failure. Kowalski's tank personally accounted for 2 Panzer IV kills and supported infantry advances that cleared 8 German strongpoints. His transmission was still running smoothly when the battle ended at 1847 hours. The final tally from St. Lo: 6 German Panzers destroyed, 4 damaged sufficiently to withdraw, 4 surviving to fight another day. American losses: 3 Shermans destroyed due to transmission failure, 2 destroyed by German fire while still mobile, 2 damaged but recoverable. The kill ratio was roughly 1-to-1, nothing spectacular by Panzer standards, except that previous engagements in Normandy had shown American kill ratios averaging 1 Sherman kill for every 0.4 German tanks destroyed. St. Lo's numbers were better because modified Shermans stayed in the fight long enough to actually engage the enemy instead of dying helpless when their transmissions quit. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks compiled the data, sent it up the chain of command with a cover memo that read simply, "Recommend immediate field modification of all Sherman tanks using Sullivan method. Estimated time to modify entire theater inventory: 72 hours. Estimated increase in combat effectiveness: 35 to 40%. Danny Sullivan spent those 11 days in a kind of exhausted delirium, moving between maintenance depots, training mechanics, supervising installations, troubleshooting problems. He slept in the back of jeeps, ate K-rations cold because there was no time to heat them, and lived with the constant knowledge that every spoon he installed might save 5 lives or cause catastrophic failure at the worst moment. The installations became routine: drop under tank, locate pressure valve, wire spoon, test clearance, mark completion. But the responsibility never did. By June 20th, Sullivan had personally supervised 437 modifications. By June 23rd, he'd trained 41 mechanics, who'd each completed 20 to 30 installations. The spoon modification spread through American armored units like a beneficial infection, tank crews requesting it by name, maintenance officers authorizing it without waiting for official approval, and nobody in the command structure officially acknowledging that they were allowing wholesale deviation from Army technical standards. The German perspective on these 11 days comes from interrogation reports and captured documents that weren't declassified until 1977. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, commanding officer of Panzer Company 316, wrote in his daily log on June 19th, "American Sherman tanks demonstrating unusual mechanical reliability. Previous intelligence indicated high failure rates during sustained combat. This is not proving accurate. Enemy tanks are maintaining combat effectiveness through extended engagements. Our tactical doctrine, which relies on Sherman mechanical failures to reduce enemy numbers, requires revision." 3 days later, on June 22nd, Oberst Heinrich Becker, regimental commander, filed a report to division headquarters that showed German armor doctrine colliding with American improvisation. American Sherman tanks in this sector are not failing at predicted rates. Our forces engaged 17 enemy tanks yesterday. Expected 4 to 6 mechanical failures based on previous engagement data. Actual failures, 2. Both caused by combat damage, not mechanical defect. Enemy armor is more combat effective than intelligence assessments indicate. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't know because no reasonable military intelligence assessment would predict it, was that American combat effectiveness had increased because a 23-year-old mechanic from Dearborn had spent 3 nights wiring bent spoons into tank transmissions. The German response was predictable. They assumed American industry had solved the Sherman's mechanical problems through improved manufacturing, better materials, or enhanced quality control. They adjusted their tactical doctrine accordingly, stopped counting on Sherman failures to even the odds, and started taking American armor more seriously as a threat. This meant German Panzer commanders fought more cautiously, withdrew more readily, preserved their forces more carefully, all because they believed they faced better engineered opponents when in fact they faced the same old Shermans with 5 cents worth of bent metal wired into the hydraulic systems. The largest single engagement of this 11-day period occurred on June 24th near Villers-Bocage, when the British 7th Armored Division, equipped with American-supplied Sherman tanks, 43 of which carried Sullivan's modification, encountered SS Panzer Division elements, including 6 Tiger tanks. The Tiger was Nazi Germany's answer to Allied armor superiority through numbers: 70 tons of steel, 80 mm gun that could penetrate any Allied tank from 2,000 meters, armor so thick that Sherman guns couldn't hurt it from the front at any range. British tankers called Tigers mobile bunkers, and their standard doctrine was to avoid them, call for air support, or attempt flanking attacks with multiple tanks, accepting that several would die to kill one Tiger. But at Villers-Bocage, something different happened that had nothing to do with tactics or bravery, and everything to do with mechanical reliability. The engagement started at 0847 hours when British lead elements encountered German armor in the town square. 2 Tigers opened fire at 800 meters, destroyed 3 British Shermans in the first 90 seconds. Textbook German armor tactics, long-range engagement, overwhelming firepower. The British response should have been withdrawal to regroup and coordinate. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Crawford, commanding the British tank squadron, ordered aggressive maneuver because his intelligence officer had briefed him that morning on the American spoon modification and its reliability improvements. Crawford later testified that his decision to close with the Tigers despite devastating initial losses was based entirely on confidence that his modified tanks would keep running during extended combat. "I knew," Crawford wrote in his after-action report, "that my lads could maneuver aggressively without worrying their transmissions would pack up at the critical moment. That knowledge changed everything." The battle lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes. British Shermans executed a complex flanking maneuver through narrow village streets, requiring multiple reversals, sharp turns, sustained high-speed running, exactly the kind of transmission-stressing operations that usually caused mechanical failures. 5 tanks broke down during the engagement, but 4 of those 5 were unmodified tanks whose transmissions failed under stress. The 38 modified tanks kept fighting, kept maneuvering, kept putting pressure on German positions until sheer numbers and aggressive tactics overwhelmed armor superiority. Final tally: 4 Tigers destroyed, 2 Tigers damaged and withdrawn, 0 Tigers captured intact. British losses: 11 Shermans destroyed by enemy fire, 5 disabled by mechanical failure. The ratio was horrific by any standard: 11 tanks lost to kill 4 Tigers. But previous engagements had shown ratios of 20-1, or worse. Villers-Bocage was expensive but survivable, and British tankers credited their ability to maneuver aggressively without mechanical failure as the decisive factor. German intelligence officer Hauptmann Friedrich Weber compiled a report on June 26th analyzing the Villers-Bocage engagement. His assessment included this passage: "Enemy Sherman reliability has improved to the point where our armor superiority is negated by numerical advantage. Previous doctrine assumed 30% mechanical failure rate for enemy armor during extended engagement. Actual rate at Villers-Bocage, approximately 13%. This represents a fundamental shift in tactical balance. Recommendation: withdraw Panzer forces from exposed positions until we can match enemy mechanical reliability or achieve greater numerical parity." Weber's report reached OB West headquarters on June 27th and contributed to German decisions to withdraw armored reserves from Normandy, decisions that helped seal the eventual Allied breakout from the beachhead. By June 25, 1944, Sullivan's modification had spread to an estimated 1,147 Sherman tanks across 3 American armored divisions and 2 British armored divisions. Total confirmed Panzer kills attributed to modified Shermans during the 11-day period: 83, including 14 Panzer IVs, 7 Panthers, 4 Tigers, and 58 lighter armored vehicles. Estimated lives saved through reduced mechanical failure rates: 6,400 Allied soldiers who would have died in or around disabled tanks. Sullivan himself participated in one combat engagement during this period on June 23rd, when the maintenance depot he was working in came under attack from German infantry with Panzerfausts. He grabbed a rifle, fired approximately 30 rounds in the general direction of the enemy, didn't hit anything as far as he knew, and spent the entire engagement terrified. His official combat action consisted of shooting badly, while mechanics who actually knew how to fight drove off the attack. The recognition came in stages, carefully calibrated to acknowledge success without officially admitting that Army regulations had been violated. On June 26th, Lieutenant Colonel Brooks submitted paperwork promoting Sullivan to sergeant and recommending him for the Silver Star for technical innovation under combat conditions, resulting in significant enhancement of combat effectiveness. The citation carefully avoided mentioning that the innovation violated equipment modification protocols and that Sullivan had originally been facing court-martial. Brooks understood bureaucratic reality. The Army could forgive unauthorized modifications if they worked, but only if nobody officially acknowledged they'd been unauthorized in the first place. On July 3, 1944, Sullivan received his sergeant's stripes and Silver Star in a brief ceremony at a forward maintenance depot where the medal presentation was constantly interrupted by the sound of tank engines and artillery fire. The presiding officer, Brigadier General Maurice Rose, pinned the medal on Sullivan's grease-stained uniform and said something that perfectly captured the paradox of military innovation. "Sergeant Sullivan, you did something that wasn't authorized, wasn't tested, and wasn't approved by any proper authority. The Army cannot condone this behavior. You're also responsible for saving thousands of lives and significantly improving our combat capability. The Army cannot ignore that either. Consider this medal your official notification that we're choosing to remember only the second part." The statistical impact of Sullivan's modification became clear in July and August 1944 as American and British forces broke out from the Normandy beachhead and swept across France. Sherman tanks equipped with the Spoon modification showed operational readiness rates averaging 79% versus 61% for unmodified tanks, an 18-point difference that translated directly into combat power. Armor commanders could plan operations knowing that 4 out of 5 tanks would be mechanically functional instead of 3 out of 5, could maintain sustained offensive pressure without worrying that a third of their force would break down during extended maneuvers, could accept combat losses knowing that mechanical failures wouldn't compound the damage. The modification wasn't perfect, transmissions still failed, tanks still broke down, crews still died. But the failure rate had dropped from unacceptable to manageable, from campaign-threatening to tactically annoying. The official Army response came in August 1944 when Ordnance Department issued Technical Bulletin 43-0317, titled Field Modification of M4A1 Transmission Hydraulic Systems. The bulletin described a procedure for installing pressure relief augmentation devices into Sherman transmissions, devices that looked suspiciously like bent mess hall spoons, but were never actually called that in official documentation. The bulletin credited field innovation by maintenance personnel without naming Sullivan, provided detailed installation instructions complete with tolerance specifications that Sullivan had worked out through trial and error, and authorized the modification for all M4 series tanks in the European theater. By September 1944, the modification was standard equipment. By November, new Sherman tanks rolling off assembly lines in Detroit incorporated a properly engineered version of Sullivan's spoon, a precisely machined pressure relief valve with secondary flow path, costing $347 to manufacture versus the original $47 valve, performing exactly the same function that Sullivan's bent spoon had achieved. Danny Sullivan spent the rest of the war as a senior maintenance NCO, training mechanics, supervising repairs, occasionally venturing forward to examine disabled tanks and determine whether they'd failed due to combat damage or mechanical defect. He participated in the liberation of Paris in August 1944, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, and the final push into Germany in 1945, always as a mechanic, never as a combat soldier, fixing tanks so other men could fight in them. His service record shows 1 Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars for meritorious service, and a combat infantry badge he earned during that one firefight on June 23rd when he grabbed a rifle and shot at Germans. The record doesn't mention court-martial charges, doesn't reference unauthorized modifications, and doesn't explain that the most decorated mechanic in the 3rd Armored Division was once facing 5 years in prison for doing exactly what made him valuable. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and Sullivan returned to Detroit in August, age 24, with $247 in back pay and no interest in staying in the Army. He went back to Ford, worked the assembly line for 3 months, hated every minute of it because factory work felt suffocating after the adrenaline and purpose of wartime maintenance. And in November 1945, he opened Sullivan's Auto Repair on Michigan Avenue using his discharge bonus and a veteran's loan. The shop specialized in transmission work. Nobody in Detroit understood hydraulic pressure systems better than Danny Sullivan after spending 3 years keeping Sherman tanks running. And for the next 33 years, he fixed cars the same way he'd fixed tanks. Quick, cheap, effective, using whatever materials and methods got the job done. He never advertised his war service, never mentioned the Silver Star, or the 6,400 lives saved, or the 83 Panzers killed. Customers knew him as a good mechanic who charged fair prices and could fix anything with an engine. They didn't know he'd changed the outcome of the Normandy campaign with bent spoons and mechanics wire. Sullivan died on March 14, 1978, age 57, from complications of emphysema developed after 33 years breathing welding fumes and engine exhaust. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press was 4 sentences long. Daniel J. Sullivan, owner of Sullivan's Auto Repair, died Thursday at Detroit General Hospital. He was 57. Mr. Sullivan served in the Army during World War II and operated his repair shop for 33 years. He is survived by his wife Margaret and 2 daughters. Nothing about Normandy, nothing about Sherman tanks, nothing about the innovation that military historians would later call one of the most significant field modifications of the European campaign. Sullivan's medals were in a box in his garage, covered in dust. The Silver Star citation was illegible, faded by 33 years of humidity. His daughters threw out most of his military paperwork when they sold the repair shop in 1979, keeping only his discharge certificate and a few photographs. The story remained buried until 1998, when Dr. Robert Henderson, a military historian researching Sherman tank reliability for a book on American armor doctrine, discovered something anomalous in maintenance records from Normandy. Between June 15 and July 15, 1944, transmission failure rates for Sherman tanks in the European theater dropped by 41%, with no corresponding change in manufacturing process, materials quality, or maintenance procedures. Henderson spent 2 years tracking down the explanation, examining maintenance logs, interviewing surviving veterans, and eventually discovering Sullivan's name in a technical bulletin from August 1944. He found Margaret Sullivan, Danny's widow, living in a nursing home in Ann Arbor. She gave him the box of medals, the faded photographs, and a single piece of bent metal she'd kept on her dresser for 20 years without knowing why. a stainless steel mess hall spoon bent at a 30-degree angle with traces of rust-colored stains that might have been hydraulic fluid or might have been blood. Henderson published his findings in 2000 in a paper titled "The Spoon Modification, Informal Innovation and Combat Effectiveness in the Normandy Campaign." The paper detailed everything: the unauthorized modifications, the court-martial charges, the 11-day period when bent spoons changed armor warfare, the 6,400 estimated lives saved. It won the Society for Military History's annual prize for research excellence and became required reading at the Army War College for courses on innovation and adaptation. The paper made clear what should have been obvious. The difference between victory and defeat often came down to some anonymous mechanic solving problems that generals and engineers couldn't solve, using materials that cost nothing and methods that violated every regulation, saving lives through improvisation that proper procedure would have forbidden. The U.S. Army issued a formal recognition in 2003, 59 years after the Normandy campaign, acknowledging Sullivan's contribution and posthumously awarding him the Legion of Merit for extraordinary technical innovation, resulting in significant enhancement of combat capability during World War II. Margaret Sullivan accepted the medal in a ceremony at Fort Knox, age 82, accompanied by her daughters and 7 grandchildren who'd never known their grandfather had done anything particularly noteworthy during the war. The medal joined the Silver Star in a display case at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor alongside one of Sullivan's original bent spoons, recovered from a museum Sherman that had been modified in June 1944, carried through France and Germany, and ended the war with its transmission still running smoothly. Modern main battle tanks don't use hydraulic transmissions. They've evolved to advanced automatic transmissions with electronic control systems. But the principle Sullivan discovered remains fundamental to military equipment maintenance. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one, the one that can be implemented immediately using available materials, the one that works right now instead of waiting for proper engineering 6 weeks from now. Every Army maintenance course teaches the story of Sullivan's spoon as an example of adaptive problem-solving under pressure. The lesson isn't violate regulations, because that lesson would be impossible to institutionalize. The lesson is understand your equipment well enough to fix it when it breaks, using whatever you have available, because combat doesn't wait for proper procedure. Sullivan's Auto Repair closed in 1979. The building housed 3 different businesses over the next 20 years before being demolished in 1999 to make room for a parking structure. There's no marker, no memorial, no indication that the mechanic who worked there once saved 6,400 lives by bending spoons. But somewhere in a warehouse at the Patton Museum, sitting in a display case next to a Silver Star and a Legion of Merit, is a bent piece of stainless steel that proves the greatest innovations don't always come from laboratories or engineering departments. Sometimes they come from mechanics lying in the mud under broken tanks, seeing problems that experts missed, finding solutions in their pockets, and having the courage to act without permission when lives depend on it.